I'm the Paris director of the Columbia Institute for Ideas and Imagination. Welcome, everyone, to Reed Hall. At the Institute, we encourage our fellows to organize public events, and as genius begets genius, our fellows have brought to Reed Hall an astonishing array of brilliant, talented, and original people. Tonight is no exception. Mae Ngai, who is a current fellow at the Institute, does us the great honor of welcoming Curtis Chin, a writer and filmmaker, to talk about this extraordinary book that's on sale from the Red Wheelbarrow, Corky Lee's Asian America, 50 Years of Photographic Justice, a retrospective of the photographer who famously documented the Asian Americans for the past 50 years and died of COVID in 2021. Curtis also directed for PBS Dear Corky, a short film we'll be watching tonight, and is the author of Everything I Learned in a Chinese Restaurant, which is also on sale tonight. Chin was a founding member of and first executive director of the Asian American Writers Workshop in New York. After the screening, Curtis will be in conversation with Mae Ngai, Lung Family Professor of Asian American Studies and Professor of History at Columbia. Most recently, she edited this beautiful book and is the author of Impossible Subjects, The Lucky Ones, and The Chinese Question. Mae is a specialist on questions of immigration and is currently working on a book that considers the uneven historical trajectory of how refuge and asylum have figured in America's national self-image and focuses on the post-World War II era of refugee settlement with its dynamics of welcome and rejection and optimism and shame. Please join me in welcoming Curtis and Mae.
Yeah, first of all, thank you everybody for coming. Thank you, Mae, for inviting me to be here at Columbia. Yeah, the Corky Lee film, Dear Corky, is a very personal film because he was a friend who I knew. I wouldn't say we were like close, intimate friends in that sense, but it's someone who I knew for like over 20 years because when you're active in the Asian American community in New York or even just across the country, he was always there, everywhere. And if Corky Lee wasn't at an event, then it wasn't a real event, you know, because he was that important to the people in the community. How this film actually came about was I was making a different film about Chinatowns in the United States. This is before COVID. There was a lot of issues that these neighborhoods were facing, particularly gentrification, an aging population, overcrowdedness. But then when COVID hit, and we invited Corky to be part of the film because he's such an expert, right? We wanted to get his opinion about these changes. But then when COVID hit and it shut down everything, we really weren't sure what we were going to do. We're like, okay, we'll pause filming. We're about 80% done with filming. We're like, okay, we'll pause for a month or two, and when this blows over, we'll finish the film. But as you guys all know, COVID didn't blow over for a long time. And as it got, further into it, we were like, well, maybe we don't have a film, right? Because at that point, the issues facing the Asian American community had suddenly shifted. It was about hate crimes, right? Asian Americans were literally being attacked physically and being killed. And so we weren't sure if our film would even matter. And then sadly, a few months further into it, Corky passed away. And we knew we were sitting on this footage, and we wanted to share it with it. So actually, the footage that you guys saw tonight, a lot of that was not stuff we were intended for that other film, right? But Corky, as you know, likes to just talk, right? So we'd be filming him about these other questions, and then he'd sort of take these sidetrack. And in some ways, for us, making this film really honors him and his goals. If you notice from this film, he's the only one that talks, right? All the photographs are his because one of the things that he oftentimes talked about was that he never got a chance to really have his own showing, right? A solo show, a chance to sort of, speak out and be himself. And so we felt like this was his chance. Even though it's done posthumously, we felt like this was Corky's chance to sort of take center stage.
Right, Corky is known, he gave himself this kind of moniker, and we love him by it. He was known as the undisputed undisputed, help
Photo
me.
laureate,
What?
photo laureate of the Asian American
The
community.
undisputed, there's another adjective. My God, I'm losing my mind.
He was a great guy.
Undisputed Asian American photographer, unofficial.
Yeah.
Undisputed, unofficial, I'm sorry, Asian American photographer laureate. And he had unofficial there because his brother, who was a lawyer, said, well, nobody ever made you that. You have to put unofficial in it. But he was definitely undisputed, and his reputation was far and wide. And I think that, if you think about what it meant that he photographed the community and the Asian American movement for 50 continuous years. 50 continuous years. So we have a record of our community's growth, its activism, everyday life, politics, culture, et cetera, which we tried to capture in the book. But I think what's really moving about the film is how, as Curtis said, it's all in his voice. And it's very moving because he talks from the heart about what he's trying to do. And he talks about what it meant to him that he did not get the recognition that he deserved.
Yeah, in some ways, for me, I even haven't fully comprehended that he's gone, right? Because I almost always expect to see him there. But, through this film and having had to edit it and go through all that, it's like his voice was still in my head long after he passed. And I think it's only now, maybe a little bit more distance, when I realized, wow, he is gone, and that maybe, hopefully by showing this film, we can encourage that next generation of activists, artists, writers to sort of step up and sort of take over where he left off.
Right. He really did leave an impressive legacy, and one of the things that I find very interesting is how he inspired young people. He gave a lot of talks and showed a lot of photographs at college campuses, but also his work has reached down into junior high schools and even young people. So right now there's a book that's being written. I saw a first draft of it, a children's book, a picture book aimed at the 5 to 8-year-old audience, and it's called Seen, right? What it means that his work makes a community seen. So it's aimed at 5-year-olds. And there was another photographer who taught a class of 4th graders in Los Angeles using Corky's photographs as a model to get kids to take photographs. So I think it's really interesting that, I'm not surprised that college students are inspired by him, but the fact that younger kids are inspired, to me, is really a lot of optimism in that.
Yeah, no, he definitely was such a valued member of our community and such a big loss.
Yeah.
When he passed. Do you want to talk about the book?
Yeah, let's talk a little bit about the book. So the book was published last year by Penguin Random House. It's 200, maybe 300, close to 300 photographs from Corky's vast oeuvre. And we did it in collaboration with the estate, which is his brother, and a friend of Corky's, who is a photographer, Chi Wang Eng. So Chi understood the photography part. I brought the history part and the contextual analysis. So in the book, and we didn't have enough to sell, but there's a QR code if you're interested in it. The book is really, in a way that is hinted at in the film, but it's a historical narrative of our communities over the 50 years that Corky took pictures. And so you can see I have this. Yeah. Some of these photographs are in the film, but not all of them. The one from the health fair, that was the first Chinatown Health Fair in 1971, where volunteers took over the center of Chinatown for 2 weeks in the summer and gave tests and blood pressure and TB and actually even VD tests to thousands of people in the community. And that's the anti-war movement, 1971, and the garment workers' strike that was in the film. And that's a Chinese-American women's drill team in Seattle that marches every year in the big Seattle parades. And that team has been in existence since the 1930s. And the last photograph is something that is iconic, that Corky took of a Sikh vigil after 9/11, the Saturday after the attack on the Twin Towers. And this film is this photograph, I think, is really striking because of the expression on this man's face. You don't really know what he's thinking, right? Is he sad? Is he hopeful? And then, of course, the motif of the flag, which is their shorthand for saying we're not terrorists, right? We're Americans. And I like to think, I mean, I don't know, I wasn't there when Corky took the picture, but Corky was able to capture in people's faces a lot of emotion. And I think he did that because before he took anybody's photograph, he talked to them. So he probably talked to these people for half an hour before he said, "Can I take your picture?" And I think because he earned their trust by talking to them, that comes through in a lot of the photographs. I just want to talk a little bit about these because Corky was not only a documentarian, he was an artist. And his skill at composition, I think, is not always recognized by maybe a lay person, but is very deliberate. So the photograph of those sojourners, in Chinese we call them the Lao Hua Chao, the old sojourners, the so-called bachelors. They're actually not bachelors, but they live alone in America for years. And in the early 70s, they were kind of an old, dying out generation. Corky stood on the corner across the street for 2 hours to get this shot. It looks spontaneous. It looks like he just happened to catch these people walking down the street, but he waited to get the composition that he wanted. The Chinese laundry waiting to be picked up, that's on his wife's mother's laundry in Manhattan. But I want to talk about the one of the girls. When I first saw this, I said to myself, how did Corky get in the girls' room? Mm-hmm. Did any of you ask that question? How did he get in the girls' room? So the story about this photograph is that it's at a dance at the Methodist Church in Chinatown in the 80s, some 1986, I think. And the social worker at the church had told the girls, these are all high school students at Brooklyn Technical High School. The social worker had told the girls, come to the dance this weekend and wear your prom dresses. Because the prom dress, your mother spent money on it, you should wear it more than once. So they come all dressed up to the prom. And Corky has this idea, he says, can you come into the bathroom and let me take a picture of you in the bathroom? And so one of them later said, I don't know, what did he wanted us to wash our hands or something? But he posed them, and years later, none of them had seen the photograph until about 3 years ago. They saw it was in an exhibit, and somebody said, hey, your picture's there. And they want you to know that none of them are smokers. And the girl with the cigarette saying, and I'm not smoking that cigarette either. I may be lighting it, but I'm not smoking it. But Corky wanted to show Chinese high school students, girls, that they were cool. And they believed they were cool. And I think that's a great story because he was able to hang out with them at the dance and say, hey, come in, let me take your picture in the bathroom.
I don't know about the hanging out with teenage girls part, but...
Yeah, right. Well, he did like
I'm kidding.
He did like to take pictures of girls. He did, that's true.
As a historian, can you talk a little bit about the significance of his work?
Well, I think, as I said, to have documented the community for 50 continuous years leaves a kind of record that we don't have by anybody else. So it's a tremendous body of work, and it grew. I mean, he always had a special place in his heart for Chinatown in New York, but he always photographed the Asian American movement, which included Japanese Americans, Filipinos, and then later, as the immigration grew, Korean Americans, South Asians, Vietnamese. And he traveled around the country. He took pictures in other parts of America, but it was mostly an East Coast thing, mostly a New York regional thing. And it's a really rich history. So if you want to know about our community and how it changed over this period where there were a lot of changes, both in terms of new immigrations, growth of the size of the community, its diversity, as well as social activism and politics, you would do well to see the book.
So you have this wonderful book. What do you hope people get out of that book? Or how do you want people to use that book?
Well, I hope it's, when we prepared the book, we had some discussion with the publishers about, did we want a coffee table book? And it's a big book. It's bigger than a normal book. We didn't want a coffee table book. We wanted people to read it. We wanted people to hold it, be able to hold it, and appreciate the pictures and read the text. So it's not a tremendous amount of text in there, but it does give you a context for the photographs.
And have you been happy with the reception to the book?
Yeah. We had good reviews, and so we're very happy with it.
Oh, good.
So let's talk about your book,
Okay, sorry. Segue.
which has got the best title of any book recently. Everything I learned in a Chinese restaurant. So tell us about this new book.
This is a book about my childhood. As the title says, everything I learned in a Chinese restaurant. I grew up in a Chinese restaurant, but I like to think of it as not just any Chinese restaurant. I like to think of it as the Chinese restaurant in Detroit. And the way I sort of gauge that is I like to start off by asking people to guess how many egg rolls you think we sold in the 65 years that we own this business. I believe in France you call them pâté impérial, right? Egg rolls? Yes. How many do you think my family sold in 65 years? How many? A million? Okay. Anybody else? 5 million. 10 million. Did you read the book? We sold 10 million. You win the prize. No egg rolls, but yeah, these are really great, delicious things to eat. And so for me, growing up, surrounded by my family with delicious food was wonderful, despite the fact that my hometown of Detroit was really suffering through a lot of problems in the 80s. You had the auto industry, which was struggling, which led to a lot of anti-Asian sentiment in Detroit. But you also had crack cocaine, you had AIDS. I knew 5 people murdered by the time I was 18 years old. But despite that, I feel like I had the best childhood because of this beautiful restaurant that my parents, were able to raise me and my 5 siblings. And so, the book is kind of a love letter. It's a thank you to them for, teaching us all the values that we needed to get on with our lives. And it's also, a love letter to my hometown of Detroit because I wanted to, I think that people still get a misconception about Detroit, but I wanted to show that Detroit was still capable of producing good things, like me. So that's the book.
One would be surprised that Chung's restaurant in Detroit is now out there as the iconic Chinese restaurant in a way. But the book it's not a typical story of a Chinese restaurant. First of all, it's in Detroit, which does not have a large Asian American community. It's a city that saw a lot of troubles. It's also a coming out story about what it meant to grow up queer in Detroit. So these are things that you might not necessarily associate with a Chinese restaurant. So can you talk a little bit about that, about how that flavors the book, so to speak, and what people can learn about that?
So the book was published by Hachette, Little Brown, and it came out a year and a half ago, but it's going into its 4th printing this summer. It's doing really, really well. It's won a lot of awards. As Mae mentioned earlier, I literally have done over 300 of these in-person events, everywhere from Korea to Germany. This upcoming week, I'm going over to Oxford University and British Library. I'm here with you all here in Paris. So it's been wonderful, the reception that the book has gotten. I think that part of the success of the book is that there's so many different ways to access it. This is what I said to my agent. I said, okay, for the people of color, we're going to talk about racism. For the gay people, we're going to talk about coming out. And for the Jewish people, we're going to talk about Chinese food. And so, if I hit all 3 audiences, I will have a bestseller, of a book. And so, I just think there are different ways. And part of it is that it's also a very 80s memoir, and it's about Detroit. And that was a very deliberate attempt on my part to make sure that when people picked up the book, they wouldn't just see this as a small Asian American story off to the side, but it's really integrated into the history of the city. And so I think that what that does is it invites non-Asian readers to sort of see themselves in this story, and they easily place themselves. And so one of the most heartening things has been the way my home state of Michigan has actually really embraced the book. I'll give you some examples, it was named Notable Book from the State Library. It was picked by the Michigan Humanities Council as the Great Michigan Read. They choose one book every 2 years, and they buy 6,000 copies, and they put me on a tour, which I think I mentioned earlier is temporarily on hold because of the current president, the funding situation. But like I've given talks to everybody from Ford Motor Company to the Pistons to the Lions. The Detroit Lions, the professional football team, said anytime I'm home, I get free tickets to the game.
Wow.
I mean, so yeah. So it's just been wonderful how the hometown of Detroit has really embraced the book.
Thank you.
Mm-hmm.
One of the things I appreciate about the book is how you talk about growing up in the restaurant, but all the different kinds of people who came to eat there, and how you learned about the diversity of the world, the diversity of the city, through it wasn't just Chinese who came to eat there, it was everybody, all walks of life, and that, what did that teach you? You talk a lot about what you learned from that.
Yeah, well, I mean, the first thing, people always ask me is like, given the title of the book, what's the most important lesson you learned? And I always say, when you're a little kid, oftentimes your parents will say, don't talk to strangers. My dad specifically gave us the exact opposite advice. They said, talk to strangers. And who they were talking about were the people sitting in our dining room. Because my dad was a kid who grew up in Chinatown, right? He never left, never went to college, but yet he could have these conversations with anybody, right? And so whenever he met somebody who had seemed really happy or just seemed really positive, he'd call all 6 of his kids to run over and barrage them with questions of like, what do you do for a living? How did you get your job? How much money do you make? And it's just this idea of like being able to talk to people that are different from you, not being afraid to ask questions if you don't know the answer, or to frankly ask for help if you need help. And so that's really guided me, and I feel like I've had these amazing opportunities in life, and it's all because of that openness that my dad, encouraged us to have. That's really been wonderful. So.
Okay, thank you.
Mm-hmm.
I think maybe we can open up for questions from the audience. Or do you want to say anything more about the book?
I don't know. How are we doing on time? Do we have time to read anything, or is it
yeah,
just?
Yeah. No, absolutely. Yeah, do read us the passage. I'm
Okay.
sorry. Yes, we do have time.
I'm kind of a mama's boy, so I always like to read this story about my mom. So if that's okay. Okay. So to sort of set this up, Detroit went through a lot of difficulties in the 80s, as I was telling you. And in particular, I'd seen a lot of negative things happen. In the 80s, AIDS was really killing a lot of people, particularly gay people. Anytime you saw a gay person, they were in the papers, they were probably dying, and their parents had disowned them. And so, that combined with the fact that we had this gruesome murder that happened like in our to one of our customers, where it's like, he used to come in all the time, ate by himself, told us he was a ER doctor. Turned out he was like a famous psychiatrist who was coming to our area to hire the prostitutes. Ran up a bill with this one girl, tried to break it off with her, and the pimp got so upset that he took a baseball bat, bashed his head in, and chopped his body up with a Ginsu knife and littered it all across the freeway. So that was my senior year in high school. And so I didn't think I had a very long lifespan with that, right? Like when you see so much death and destruction. And so I didn't understand the value of going to college. But, my mom, who was an immigrant, really, really wanted us to go because she had an arranged marriage, right? She had to drop out of high school, came to America, hated her life working in that Chinese restaurant. And so she had this mantra for all of us, which was work hard, obey your elders, and be quiet. Right? That's the one thing she kept pounding into us. And so I rationalized, what would be me giving up 4 years of my life for a woman who's given up her whole life for me? And so I made a deal with my mom. I said, okay, Mom, I'll apply to college, but I will only apply to one school. And if I don't get in, I'm not going. And she's like, okay, fine, apply to Michigan. And so I applied to Michigan, and sadly I got in. And so I ended up going to school. I was one of those kids that actually worked full-time and went to school at night. And I didn't know what I was going to study, right? But, when you look at that evening course catalog, you see there's a lot of creative writing classes. And so I did the math, because Asians were good at math. I did the math, and I said, if I only studied poetry and wrote haikus, I could graduate in fewer than 500 words. And so that was my whole goal for graduating college. I would write haikus. And so I guess I wrote a pretty good haiku because I got into the creative writing program, which only accepted 20 people. And so I would love to read the story, dedicated in some ways to my mom. Oh, one thing about reading the book is that you're supposed to read it like you're going to a Chinese restaurant. So the opening line is "Welcome to Chung's," and the closing lines are like, "Please come again." And so each of the chapters are like listed like a Chinese menu. So this might not make sense, but this is chapter M7. Okay, so M7. Being a creative writing major made me the literary expert at Chung's. That was inevitable, as my dad asked every customer, "Have you met our number 3? He's the writer in the family." Every time he mentioned my program, the number of students accepted got smaller and smaller. At some point, I expect him to say I was the only one on campus even allowed to own a pen. One week, one of our waiters was out sick. My younger siblings were busy with their weekend activities, so I was the one called in to help. I jumped at the chance of some home-cooked meals for a few days. I was running around the dining room, refreshing our customers' silver teapots, when a white middle-aged woman reached into her oversized bag and pulled out a colorful hardcover. "Have you read this book? It's so good." The Joy Luck Club, the recently released novel that featured a bunch of old, sassy Chinese ladies who like to eat, gossip, and play mahjong, could have easily been set in our back kitchen. Every time I came in to help at the restaurant, another diner, usually older and female, cited the most memorable characters, lines, and scenes. They all wanted to know if I was working on something similar. I was writing poetry, but they didn't care. To them, all writers were the same. They would squeal, "You could be the next Amy Tan." My mom turned out to be the biggest pusher. She rarely had a book in her hand, but the success of the Joy Luck Club convinced her that her life was a bestseller too. She followed me around the dining room, dropping stories from her childhood, the same ones I'd heard growing up, but now she recounted them as if she was auditioning for her own books on tape. One night, after seeing how our waiters sometimes pooled their tips together, my mom shared an oldie. "When the communists marched south, they targeted my family. My uncles and grandpa were rich in America, so the Red Guard called us traitors. My stubborn grandma didn't want to leave her big home, so when my parents escaped to Hong Kong, they left me behind to keep her company. The communists hated me and my pawpaw. When I was 4, they made me watch as they forced my grandma to climb the old banyan tree in our courtyard. Then they pushed her off into a pile of broken glass." For a visual, my mom rubbed her knees. Another time, standing at the water station, she launched into her own nautical tale. "When I was 5, my uncle in America paid $25,000 in renminbi, a king's ransom in people's money, to a local fisherman to ferry our remaining family out of China. After a long ride tucked under the planks of his fishy fishing boat, we came up for air. But we weren't in Hong Kong. The trader had turned us into the authorities. In jail, I had to sing Communist Party songs to earn extra rice for me and my grandma." Another chapter came as we stood beneath a painting of the Chinese countryside. "When my pawpaw and I were freed from jail, we found that the officials had given away our home to peasants. We were forced to live several villages away in a dirt hut with 3 other families. Whenever we went out for a pail of water, my grandma had to bend low to keep her head below the soldiers." Once again, she gave me a demonstration, this time bowing her head. Granted, my mom's epic saga interested me. Who wouldn't be intrigued by tales of prison cells, guns, and stolen ransoms? Even the parts about her mundane life in Hong Kong, after she was reunited with her siblings and parents, were amusing. But these were her stories, not mine. She had to tell them, not me. I was in school to find my own voice. I sat and listened, but that was as far as it would go. Toward the end of the summer, as I was at the back table sipping my red pop, stockpiling poems for the upcoming semester, my mom sat down. Before I could say anything, she started talking. "I was a top student in Hong Kong. When Pepsi came to town, they held a big contest for students to draw a picture of their own school. Mine was the best at Sacred Heart. I won 6 cases. There were so many bottles, I had to give some to the nuns." I threw down my Parker pen, the one I treated myself to after getting into the program. "Yes, and they kept burping all day. It was so funny. You've told me that story over and over, and I don't even like Pepsi. I prefer Coke." My mom's shoulders shriveled. The shine faded from her rosy cheeks. "You don't want to hear my story?" I tensed up. "I do, but I'm behind on my own stuff. Between working at Drake's, the Journal, and Saving the World, my schedule was packed. On top of that, my workshops in the fall were advanced. Still insecure about my place in the program, I put pressure on myself to create more interesting writing by staying up late and scribbling in my notebook every detail of my life. But no matter how hard I tried, working harder could not produce a better poem." My mom lifted herself off her seat. The glint in her eyes orphaned me. Her 42 years of life flashed before my eyes. She'd gone from Guangzhou to Hong Kong to Detroit and spent the past 2 decades raising her 6 children in a hostile foreign land. She tried to prove that her life had worth, that it hadn't gone unnoticed, and here I was, the ungrateful son, writing it off. Her lips quivered in a soft murmur. I hastily picked up my pen, backtracking. "Go ahead, Mom, I'll write it down this time." My mom bowed her head as if I were one of the soldiers holding a gun to her temple, ordering her to sing. "No, you go on. You do your own thing." I reached out my hand, but by then she had disappeared through the black swinging door, leaving only the rattling from the kitchen, the clanging woks and rumbling dishwasher. I sat there upset at myself for being so inconsiderate. Everything I'd done in the past 3 years had been for her, but it seemed as though I had failed the final test. My education wasn't just to help me get a better life. It was for my whole family. We were a team. We were the 8 immortals. How could I let them down? I needed to make things right, but I knew that, like most disappointments in our house, apologies were never spoken. Only deeds would bring about reconciliation. So. It's for my mom. Mm-hmm.
Time for questions or comments from the audience? Yes.
Hello, my name is Nancy Ng Duclos. I live in Paris, and I was born in Windsor, Ontario, right across from Detroit. And I bet you my
House of
family
Lee?
knew your father. No, Paradise Restaurant on the riverfront.
Oh, wonderful.
Thank you very much for your precious and poignant documentation of the communities, and thank you especially for your main character. I was wondering if you could explain why you think after 50 years of documenting the community, why was his work never recognized the way it should be? Now, Curtis, you're a co-founder of the Asian American Writers Association. I imagine that would be sometime in the 80s, right? That was a pretty exciting time for those of us who were trying to find our voice, express ourselves, and find our place in society. So I can't help but wonder what you're thinking. Do you think 50 years later, are we still struggling to find our place, to be recognized? And then we look at where we are today. How is DIE and the way it's being handled? How is that affecting our projects, our visions, our funding?
Are you an artist yourself, writer?
I'm sorry?
Are you an artist yourself, a writer?
I'm a journalist. I work in the media, but I was one of the co-founders of the Can-Asian Artist Group in Canada that did work with the Asian Americanists.
I'm sure we have a lot of mutual
Rick
friends.
Shiomi, David Wong.
Wonderful.
Wayne Wang. That was my generation.
Oh,
So,
nice. Yeah.
A small world, right?
Yeah.
It is a small world.
Do you want to talk a little bit about?
I can start and then
Yeah.
you can follow. I think Corky was, well, there's a couple of reasons why he didn't have the fame, maybe, that he should have had when he was still alive. One is, I think, frankly, we took him for granted. He was at every event, no matter what the event was, he was always there. He was a fixture. And I think we always thought he would always be there. Also, you know, he was in shows, group shows, he had a few solo shows. His photos were all over the internet. I think we just assumed he would be around forever. But there's another reason. Corky also started, he had some interest in photojournalism, but he always understood the politics of the gatekeepers in the mainstream media. So he had the famous photograph of the police roughing up the guy that got on the front page of the Post, and he had quite a few other photographs. The famous one of the Miss Saigon rally, he sold that to the New York Times. But he felt that the editors were always too constraining, you know? And so there was one story he would tell about, he took a picture of some older Chinese women protesting the opium perfume. That was it Christian Dior? There was Yves Saint Laurent had an opium, and so there was a protest in the community about using opium to sell fragrance, and these old ladies, these garment workers, were carrying signs about opium is poison. And he went to the Post, and he spoke to the photo editor, and he goes, "Yeah, it's not that interesting. It's local," and so he didn't take the photo. And so Corky went back later that day and spoke to the evening editor, who liked it and took the photo. Well, the first guy swore that Corky would never have a photograph in the Post again, ever. So he understood that there was this gatekeeping, and so he, over the years, I think he continued to sell some freelance photographs to newspapers, but not as much as he had in the beginning, or that he actually maybe had wanted to. And I think he became more of defined himself more as a social photographer, as an activist photographer, and those people are not recognized by the mainstream, right?
Yeah, so I entered the picture more like in the 90s, not quite the 80s, but the 90s. And the case that really spurred me to sort of think about storytelling was the Vincent Chin murder, which do people here know what the murder is here? Most people know. So quickly, in Detroit in the 80s, a lot of anti-Japanese sentiment, which led to a lot of anti-Asian sentiment. Vincent Chin was a Chinese-American out celebrating his upcoming wedding. He goes to the strip club. At some point, these two white auto workers come in, and they're overheard saying, "It's because you mother blanks that we're out of work." They're all kicked out of the bar. These two guys get in their car, and they drive around the streets of Detroit until they see Vincent sitting outside of McDonald's waiting for his ride to pick him up. They take a baseball bat out of their car, and they bash his head in. You know what I mean? And our families were friends. My uncle was his best man. And so when you're a 14-year-old kid and you know somebody that's in the hospital fighting for their life, you're going to see, you're going to check the papers, you're going to check the radio, the TV to see how they're reporting on it. None of them were covered on it. I checked the next day, nothing again. The next day after that, nothing. It took the mainstream media 12 whole days before they covered that story. Meanwhile, the Chinese community was coming to our restaurant, like, all the time, saying what happened, who was there, trying to get the latest gossip. And that contrast between what the mainstream media covered and what our community cared about really stuck out at me, because several months later, when the judge came back with the sentence of only $3,000 fine, saying they never had to serve a single day in jail, his rationale was, you don't put these type of people in jail. And so to me, it's like, well, what type of people do you put in jail? And it made me realize that it's all because this judge didn't see us Asian Americans as people worthy of equality, and protection and justice in this country. And so that's when, I lugged the typewriter. Do you guys know what those are, right? The typewriter from the back of the kitchen to the dining room, and I just started writing these letters to the editor. And that was my first activism, and it all had to do with, like, how do we get more Asian American stories out there, And so that was the spirit I brought moving to New York after I graduated from college, and creating, or co-creating this organization called the Asian American Writers Workshop, which, if anybody here studies Asian American literature, it's like a who's who of people who are either on the board, on the staff, interns, everybody from Min-Jin Lee to Hua Shu to Chimpa Lahiri to Hanya Yanagihara to Alexander Chi, Ocean Vuong. They're all part of it. It's just, and so when you ask that question, are things better now? Definitely. There's so many voices now out there. I do think that it's a little bit more challenging now because to be a working artist has become even more difficult, right? Because of the way things are done, thanks to streaming services and publishing. But the fact that you have more choices, right? There's so many authors out there is just wonderful, I think. Oh, and one thing I do at all my talks, these 300 talks, is I take a group selfie. So at some point, I'd like to do that. So don't leave before we take the group selfie, okay? Okay.
Actually, I'd like to make a comment and ask you a question about publishing today.
Oh, yeah.
Because there's a lot of Asian American writers who are being published today. Fiction, nonfiction, memoir is extremely popular. You have a memoir that's done very well. I will say personally that I don't think a lot of memoirs that are being published are that good. There's a kind of, well, no, yours is very different, but there's a kind of recipe that the publishing industry wants. They want to talk about the immigrant who left a war, whether it's the Korean War or the Chinese Revolution. They come to America, they struggle, then they're successful, and there's a story that goes back to Joy Luck Club of the generational conflict, And almost every book has this formula in it. And I think one reason why your book is so wonderful is because it doesn't hew to that formula. But I wonder what you think about this trend, because it's true, a lot of stuff is getting published, but it's one kind of book.
Yeah, I mean, it's the same thing, because my day job is working in TV and film, and while it's great that, when I was growing up, you would never see an Asian American TV show on. It's great that now there are more Asian American shows, but you do have to question what type of Asian American shows are there, and can we see a little bit more diversity beyond just, karate films, or gangster ones, right? Or anything with Michelle Yeoh, you know what I mean? So you want that to diversify. And I would say that even with book publishing, yeah, to some degree, I mean, there are a lot of problems with publishing. I am published by what's called a Big Five in America. We have 5 major publishing companies. And people say that they are working off the same model that they had in the 17th century in terms of how you sell books. And when you are a person of color and you're writing a story, they don't have the ability to sort of like connect you with your community, and so they find oftentimes they find ones that are more appealing to a more general audience, oftentimes non-Asian readers, and they have this certain expectations of what non-Asians will read or are interested in reading. But as we continue to see more Asian American books published, right, and hopefully more diverse stories, and at the same time we also work to develop an Asian American audience, then I think then you will find a more diverse range of stories. And that's partly why I've gone on this crazy book tour, because part of it is that my book did sell for a good amount of money. It was a bidding war. It sold in like 10 days, between the Big Five. So there was a lot of heat on my book. But I read this article in The Guardian about Black British writers who, right after George Floyd was murdered, a lot of them were able to sell their books for good money. But because all those books underperformed sales-wise, it's actually been more difficult now for Black British writers to sell books. And because I knew that my book did well selling, I did not want that to happen to Asian American writers as well. I didn't want publishers to say, look, we bought a book, but it doesn't sell. So I knew that I had to put in this extra effort to make sure that this book was a success, so that the next time an Asian American author pitches a book to a publisher, they can point to this success of saying, look, there is an audience out there, so.
Hi, thank you so much. This is great. So I have, as just like layperson, I have not much knowledge about the Asian American experience except what I see and read. But my question was about form and how you told the stories of your mom within the story of you, and how it, even when you're reading it, it's like very fast of like stories that I was like, wait, as someone who works on war, like boats and prisons and being hit and stuff, but they're like, the story is like 2 sentences each, but then it slows down when you're talking about your own, like her disappointment with you and your relationship with her. So is this a way in which you tell, okay, your mom, of course, but also the experience of Asian American immigrants in a like fast way within the narrative? Or like, you know what I mean? What I'm asking is about the choices you make about the stories of telling of really horrible violence, but in a very fast pace within your own narrative of coming out of jail and your relationship.
I just talk fast.
No, but they are fast.
No, but to be honest with you, okay, so the prologue of the book is about my family's journey. I jokingly say how my great-great-great-grandfather moved from Canton, China to Canton, Ohio, before realizing there are Chinese people there. And so the prologue does follow that. And then, this part where I read about my mom does talk about China, but the rest of the story is really based in Detroit. It's really an American story, because I really want to tie it into the history of the city, right? And so the part that I read, that is the only part that really is more transnational. But in terms of...
But the decision, I mean, this is fascinating, but the decision to include these kind of stories is basically to tell, like, I'm just like thinking about how you thought about the reader.
Well, because my mom would tell us these stories, but if you actually think about the amount of violence, because you're talking about violence, right?
Yeah.
What happened in Asia, the violence that's more present for me is actually what happened in Detroit. I go into depth about the Vincent Chin murder and how that changed me, right? Like there's a couple of chapters on it, or, like AIDS, or the violence that, I see in Detroit. So to me, that's a much more palpable thing that really shaped me versus what happened. And so the amount that I talk about China in that is the extent of my knowledge. It's not that I have deliberately not included details that I didn't know. That's all I know.
Yeah, and
Yeah.
that's not what
Does
I
that
meant.
make sense? Oh,
yeah,
is that
no,
not?
I'm just talking about the speed. Anyways, thank you.
Okay. I guess you're a writer.
An extended question. Will there be story of your mother's stories?
Well, this is kind of my mom's story. I mean, this book. Yeah.
But from your perspective as her son, sort of experiencing her, but given that you grew up with her story sort of like, draping your life in this really important way, to extend your question, will there be an opportunity, or is that something you think about? What?
I don't. You mean maybe a fictionalized version, where I actually just, because I'd have to, right, fill in the gaps. I just don't know the knowledge of all this stuff.
But your mom, because you say your mom told these stories over and over again, right? And in Fei Eng's book, Orphan Bachelors, her parents and the old immigrants, they also tell stories. Lots, and they're kind of tall tales even, about how they fled from the communists and the bayonets were at their backs, and how they had to swim, not just across a river, but they had to swim across an ocean, and they're outsized stories, and they tell them over and over again. And her analysis is that they tell these stories to say, in a way, our lives are really hard here, but it's better than what we left. And it's a way of them understanding their immigration, right? That their lives might be really, really difficult here. They're poor, they work really hard, they don't seem to make it anywhere. But we survived the communists and the bayonets. And so I don't know if you think your mom's stories, does that resonate at all with you?
I feel like the reason my mom told the stories is because she feels like she got the short end of life. She, was this really smart woman who got a full ride to a top school in Hong Kong. Very, very pretty. I'll show you a picture if you guys want to see how pretty she is. But she just never had a lot of opportunities. And I'm working on a sequel right now, and one of it talks about like how when we were kids, she was really obsessed with reincarnation. And the thing that she would always say is like, I must have killed someone in a previous life to deserve this.
Oh, gosh.
Because she just hated her life in Detroit. Do you know what I mean? And so I think for her telling the story was, I don't think she overcame it like the way you're saying that, like Fei Eng's. I think she's still sadly stuck in this sense of loss, right? And me as her son to tell the story is the recapturing for her. It gives her life. It gives her life meaning. It gives her success, right? And I think that's what it represents for her. Yeah, because she can't do it on her own. She has such abandonment issues and other things that have really, in some ways, crippled her in some ways. Yeah.
So you're going to write her story for her?
Well, no, I feel like this is.
We're decided.
No, my next book is actually, so in 2005 I was writing for the Disney Channel because I write TV stuff, and then I get this terrible phone call that my parents are in a car accident back home in Detroit, and my dad passed away, and my mom was severely injured, and my brother Chris, who in this book is the golden child, because every Chinese family has one, he's like the golden child. He's a doctor in Los Altos Hills. He immediately whisks my mom out to California to help her recuperate, and by the end of that first week, all my other siblings decided they were also going to move to California to help my mom, and I was left behind in Detroit trying to decide, do I go back to Hollywood and continue this pursuit of TV writing? And back then, 20 years ago, there were very, very few opportunities for Asian Americans. Or do I stay in Detroit and take over this fabulous restaurant that, my great-grandfather founded? And so that book is called Leftovers, and it's more of a love letter to my dad. Yeah.
Well, thank you all for coming.
Selfie.
Curtis, oh, right. Curtis
Okay.
has to take the selfie.
Yes.
Right.
It's a very